in the inky darkness of the night. Twinkling stars bejewel the sky. All the townspeople are tucked safely in their godly beds. But underneath the moon's watchful eye, a strange gaggle of women, femmes too, are gathered around a raging fire, cauldron bubbling. They're clad in nothing but velvet robes and pointed hats. And are those broomsticks they're carrying? It is! Something secretive, something sinister is brewing. The witching hour has struck!
Welcome to episode 2 of our podcast, where we explore books and media to provide literary and political analysis about gender, race, religion through a critical lens. I'm Jasmine.
And I'm Soha.
And we will be your guides through the spellbinding world of witches. If you listened to our last episode, you will know that this is episode 2 of 3 of our monster miniseries. And I know what you're thinking. Is the witch really a monster? Isn't that a bit of a stretch?
You may be thinking there's no way Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Sandra Bullock in Practical Magic, and Kiki from Kiki's Delivery Service are considered monsters. And you would be right, I don't think they're monsters. They are disarming, they're sweet, and more often than not use their magic to help others overcome personal challenges.
Not a monstrous evil figure that prey on people, not even close. But were they always as such? If you were paying very close attention to episode 1, we hinted that the witch has undergone a transformation.
Last episode, we talked about the vampire's evolution from fearsome, disgusting corpse to viable, sexy, romantic love interest. The witch, too, transforms from monster, copulating with the devil and baby eater, to a lovable 13-year-old with a big red bow, or a woman in her 20s in a floral sundress looking for love, fighting evil.
Arguably, the witch has undergone an even stronger transformation, which has resulted in the witch being portrayed in mainstream media even more than the vampire. Maybe vampires aren't your cup of blood, but chances are you've enjoyed some kind of story with witches in it. It's pretty hard to avoid. I mean, have you seen Hocus Pocus? No Hocus Pocus haters allowed on this podcast.
In this episode, we will explore what magic really is. In literature and movies, at least. What is the witch? Real-life witch hunts, the transformation of the witch to what we know today. We'll take a closer look at the witch in media over time. And finally, we'll talk about reclaiming the witch identity. That's quite a lot to cover, so grab your potions and a cup of tea and settle in for this bewitching episode.
Section 1. Who's that witch? Defining the witch and witchcraft.
Simply, a witch is a practitioner of magic, typically a woman. For some time, witchcraft was widely accepted as a skill that someone could possess and then wield based on that individual's own sense of morality. A witch could do good or bad, help the community or hurt it. The witch was a figure that people in the community either feared or depended on. Regardless, she was respected and sometimes even accepted.
But that's not how the witch is remembered historically and in literature. 1,000 years after the life and death of Christ, the connotation of witch was overwhelmingly negative. But its earlier etymology, from the Old English Wicca, if I'm saying that correctly, simply meant female magician or sorceress. Later down the line, it eventually became used to describe, and I quote, a woman supposed to have dealings with the devil or evil spirits and to be able, by their cooperation, to perform supernatural acts, end quote. And in this podcast, we'll interrogate and think critically through this shift in meaning and connotation.
In the white Western Christian imagination, to be a witch is to be threatening a sense of social order with their magic abilities that they gained precisely because they copulate with the devil. They're demon lovers. In order to understand what a witch is, we unfortunately must look at a very nasty text called the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, written in 1486.
It's around 125,000 words of misogyny and demon sex written by a nasty boy by the name of Henrik Kramer, which we'll talk more about him later. But for now, we want to note how important this text was in not only describing how to deal with witches, spoiler alert, it was torture, but also in defining the witch herself.
Dr. Rosie Whitcomb's video essay, Shirley Jackson, Witches, and the Demon Lover Trope, shares with us how the Malleus Maleficarum proposes that women are the weaker gender, therefore susceptible to attacks by demons. That attack usually being carnal copulation. Funnily enough, Mickey Brock, a professor of witches, describes the Malleus Maleficarum as filled with demon sex and misogyny. Kramer seemed to be very fixated on both of those things, and specifically how demon lover sex is painful for women and is all about inflicting pain and evil. He was also obsessed with women being seduced or raped by demons.
This is important because it set the tone of how popular culture viewed witches. No more were the times where a witch in your community could help you with your ailments. Now she was evil. She was feared because she threatens and undermines Christian order by fornicating with the devil for her magical abilities.
Historically, and even today, the source of power in witchcraft is thought to come from impure, dark, satanic forces, while the source of power called upon in religion is pure and godly. The witch as a figure was seen as a woman who chooses to renounce good and God and make a pact with the devil, accepting evil powers. Kramer's text plays a large part in the lasting narrative for at least those of us in the West.
All of this is to say that witches were not seen favorably, which had real-world consequences.
The real and sordid history of the witch.
Let's talk more about the man behind the Malleus Maleficarum. Henrik Kramer, a loser and an incel, and technically a demonologist. So he received a note from the Pope to hunt witches in Germany and Austria, but he was not doing a very good job. People originally thought he was wacky and didn't buy into his bullshit. Good for them. So he fled like a loser to Innsbruck, where unfortunately his misogynist rhetoric got some recognition.
His handbook that we've been talking about, the Malleus Maleficarum, becomes a handbook for all witch hunters for its time. The book says it isn't just harmful magic, it's making a pact with the devil, like we talked about. And lawyers became obsessed with these small details and began to torture women immediately through a series of sort of false reports, like things that are conjecture. So when something is likened to the devil, it's acceptable to use any type of force. And that is why torture was the like Henrik Kramer's and the Malleus Maleficarum's primary, I wouldn't even say suggestion. It was more than that. It was a demand, I would even say.
Yeah.
In this lecture called The Faces of Evil, Context and Persona by Mickey Brock, she talks about how you don't have to treat people with morality if you say that they're devilish. That becomes sort of fertile ground to do anything. It's not just illegal behavior, witchcraft that is, but evil behavior. And sort of normal rules don't apply. So you can dehumanize people. If they are evil, then it goes out the window, these acceptable ways of treating people. And it's seen as justified and condoned in this stance of rooting all evil out. And unfortunately, we still see this kind of behavior today.
In the scheme of witch hunts, there are accusations and trials, which are facades of reason. But imagine pitchforks and persecution. The documentary that we're referencing says that that's not actually how witch hunts went about. There was usually a village committee that was an amateur panel of people whose job it was to find and root out witches.
It's a committee. Official complaints were sent to the committee, and then a trial would happen. So you would say, Miss such and such over there hexed my cows and they're not producing any milk. And then, yeah, really wild stuff. Then it must be Miss such and such or Miss so and so. And then this committee would then, quote unquote, formally investigate. But these trials were only occurring to give a sense of legitimacy to these illegitimate claims. So a trial typically happens to prove whether someone is guilty or not, but oftentimes people's minds were made up beforehand. Because you cannot prove anything in these trials. Magic is immaterial by nature. There is no hard evidence that could be used in courts. In reality, these trials were people being tortured to give false confessions that were then used against them. An example, a very interesting example, okay, this is an interesting tale, so, lock in here. In 1582, in this town called Trier, there were witch hunts, in the fashion we've been describing. And there's this man named Deirdrick Flauder, and he's a judge presiding over many of these trials. But the kooky part is a 16-year-old boy he accused Deirdrick Flauder, this man who was just torturing and killing witches, he was accused of witchcraft himself. Like I guess, a 16-year-old boy, he claimed that he saw Deirdrick Flauder being taken along in a witch's Sabbath. But what's interesting about this is Deirdrick Flauder was not only a judge presiding over these witch trials. He also was like some kind of like land-owning white man. And it's interesting because in this story, people, like the townspeople, were also quite upset with Deirdrick Flauder because he kept like raising the price of like a very important grain that people needed to to eat to survive, and it was all on his land, and people were like, oh, you're controlling the weather and all of our crops are dying, but yours aren't dying, and then you're price gouging us. And then he was accused of witchcraft. The archbishop at the time protects him from these accusations, but they were so strong, people were convinced that he was a witch, or they were just really trying to take him down. And he was put on trial in 1587. In August, there was a trial against him, and the very same tactics of humiliation and torture were used on him. It was like this, like, class revenge, Uno reverse, that they did on this witch trial judge. He put the very legal infrastructure in place to kill witches that was used against him, and it didn't protect him. So the peasants used those same tools to, I guess, enact some type of justice. I think the story ends that he dies. Like, I'm pretty sure that he is killed in the same way that he killed many people.
Speaking of class justice, dear listener, are you still there? We'd like to share how Silvia Federici, esteemed Italian Marxist feminist and scholar, views the witch hunts as a necessary precondition in the transition from feudalism to capitalism. And then we will give you our thoughts. So her magnum opus, the work that she's most known for, is called Caliban and the Witch, which was published in 1998.
That's a great title, by the way.
It's an amazing title.
It's a great title. I love the name Caliban, but anyways, keep going.
Yeah, in this text, she argues that witch trials are a tool of early capitalism. And how so, you may ask? Well, the argument is that witch trials normalized, publicized, and incentivized violence against women. So think of it this way. Witch trials equals violence against women equals precondition to capitalism. But let's start at the beginning of her argument, which is the end of feudalism. So in the article, Witch Hunts and the Birth of Capitalism, Reflections on Caliban and the Witch, we start with the plague!
Dun, dun, dun.
In the 14th century, killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population, and that population shortage meant that peasants became empowered. Their labor was a hotter commodity because available working bodies became scarce. They had something to leverage against their feudal lords. Possibilities of this newfound leverage meant that peasants and serfs, the common people, laborers, they were able to challenge the nobility's power. Heretic movements sprang up. There could be possibilities beyond feudalism. Throughout the entire European continent, social movements and rebellions were happening. People were asking for something more egalitarian. They wanted better social and economic conditions. They demanded a new and more equal society.
I mean, what an exciting time. I mean, right? It's out of a ton of despair and like social upheaval, but they're on the precipice of something, like a different system, a more equitable, egalitarian system could have been there, but instead of Marxism, socialism, or any other of like similar economic systems, feudalism transformed into capitalism. No, why did that have to happen?
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. That's the timeline we're in.
Unfortunately, capitalism happened, and Federici writes that not only did the possibility of equitable economic alternatives disappear, but it also put a stop to the independent and economic opportunities of women, which they supposedly had under feudalism. What kinds of independence were afforded to women under feudalism, you may ask? Jude Ellison Sadie Doyle, in article capitalism, which is women witch hunts, is that for serfs who tilled the land in exchange for its crops, home was work, and vice versa. Men and women grew the potatoes together. So that is to say that women participated in wealth accumulation, in the accumulation of coin. They were earning their keep in the same manner as their husbands, their sons, their brothers.
On Federici further writes, in capitalism, waged laborers have to work outside the home all the time, which means someone else needs to be at home all the time doing the domestic work. Gender roles and the subjugation of women became newly necessary. Jasmine, tell us your thoughts on this. Tell us your thoughts.
Newly. Listen, I think that the subjugation and economic erasure of women has occurred before and even during feudalism, before the advent of Christ, and it continues after, it continues now. Agree with Doyle when they wrote that early feudal elites in rural Europe enclosed public land, rendering it private and controllable, and patriarchy enclosed women in private marriages, imposing on them the reproductive servitude of bearing men's children and the emotional labor of caring for men's every need. But I think that women, even when they worked in the fields together with men under feudalism, they experienced this enclosure. I don't think that it necessarily sprang new under capitalism, but maybe you could argue that it heightened it. My understanding is that women did not have the same access to social, religious, and economic capital as men under feudalism, before feudalism, even though everyone of all genders worked the fields. And marriage under the church during and before feudalism was not equitable. They've always brunt the burden of reproductive servitude and emotional labor, and they continue to do so. But I will concede that perhaps this enclosure became more burdensome under capitalism. Maybe those bondages became more restrictive. Maybe they became more apparent.
Let us know what you think. Let us know what you think. What's your take on Federici's work here? How do you interpret this? I mean, is it really fair to say that this specific kind of oppression of women began at the end of feudalism? I do think that there's really strong ties between capitalism, Christianity, and the subjugation of women. I think that that's true, and I think that's pretty interesting in Federici's work. Yeah, let's continue on. Let's continue on with her stuff.
Yeah. So my ignorance notwithstanding, I think I could just state that with certainty that patriarchy existed before feudalism, and patriarchy continues to exist after feudalism. The combination of patriarchy and capitalism is one that we're all too familiar with. It's interwoven and tightly linked and seem inextricable from one another. To disentangle and dismantle the systems is the goal. I don't disagree with Federici on that.
And I will say, if you ever get the chance to read Federici's stuff, she's very convincing. Like she is. Like you read it, you read her work, and you're like, yeah, that like checks out. That makes total sense. But it is through like a web of carefully constructed, ideas, points, and history. Which I guess makes a good argument. But I think that there's more to the story, I think, is what Jasmine's getting at too. The frame is limited, which is okay. I think that Federici's argument, nonetheless, like opened up our perspective and how, I don't know if she's the one who opened up the perspective on like how capitalism and patriarchy work together. I think that her addition really was like the witch hunts had to do with it. And yeah, but you read like how she describes the witch hunts being part of it, and you're like, yeah,
Absolutely.
That's primitive accumulation. That's exactly what happened. Women's bodies were part of it. It just makes a lot of sense when she writes about it. She's a really good writer, so yeah.
So I think that Federici's argument can be summed up that the witch hunts are a form of state-sanctioned violence against women. Communally, morally, religiously sanctioned. And this portion of the equation, this portion is necessary to usher in capitalism, because capitalism led to the economic and social degradation of women by excluding them from the accumulation of capital. And as a result, women and their bodies were devalued. Andreas Bieler writes that the control of women and their bodies became a direct part of capitalist accumulation. The female body, the uterus, was placed at the service of population increase and the production and accumulation of labor power. Like with the rhetoric that we are kind of fed now in the era of tradwives, in the era of anti-birth control rhetoric, in the era of this kind of pro-natalist, have more children messaging that seems to really dominate a lot of online discourse. I agree with that. She's onto something. She's onto something. It is so easy to make the connection that all of these social movements that are happening online is because there needs to be an increase of labor power, but a specific kind of labor and person.
Yeah, I mean, under racial capitalism and also chattel slavery, like, I think that this argument makes some sense and is particularly relevant. Like, the production of more bodies was more enslaved labor, and that increased the capital of enslavers. And then today it's like, okay, the nation state, empire, whatever you want to call it, urges this like general population to maintain these rigid gender roles, but also takes away access to things like birth control and abortions, and forces people to have more children, to have more laborers, to make the elite ruling class richer, but also to be in the army, right? to be the foot soldiers for the empire. Yeah, it's very tied up, I think, in capitalism and timeline that we're in.
Yeah. And I feel like all these white nationalists and their great replacement theories and the Elon Musks with the massive brood, they're also really concerned about making sure that white bodies are constantly being reproduced in some sort of very strange,
very scary, very nefarious way. Yeah. But what does this have to do with witches?
I think this has to do with witch hunts as a form of not just only policing women, targeting women, making women more subservient and obedient, and putting them in line so as to not attract attention where one might not necessarily, I wouldn't say invite the accusation of being a witch, but to kind of mitigate that threat, or that very real threat, actually. But it's also like, I think what Federici is saying is that women removing their source of like wealth, their accumulation of like coin and wealth, are only able to provide their uteruses, their bodies, in servitude of men. Federici put out a newer book called Witches, Witch Hunting, and Women, and there are tidbits that I really enjoyed in that book. Like, Federici explores the criminalization of gossip during and after the witch hunts. Doyle writes that Federici, quote, traces a concise and damning history of how a term commonly indicating a close female friend turned into one signifying idle, backbiting talk, end quote. And how that act of gossip, of women speaking to each other, often about men in a way those men might not like. That is to say that people who are thought to gossip, people who are thought to be witches, were criminalized, and those people were women, because men can't possibly be gossips, nor be witches. But ultimately, witch hunts are about power, and wielding that power to stop threats to patriarchy, whether they be gossips or witches or both. Because when women gossip, it's not always what one might see or imagine frivolously in the media. It's not always cattiness and mundane competition and backbiting. It's not always about tearing down your fellow women, but gossip has often served as a means, sometimes the only means of protection for women who are often afforded very little autonomy in their lives.
And in my violence against women class, we actually talked about this very concept about how gossip, what's considered gossip, actually keeps women safe. We talked about this idea of like inside bathroom stalls, like people, like women would write other women notes, like basically what Jude Ellison Sadie Doyle writes, like women sharing identities of abusers and harassers to keep each other safe.
Even now, we continue to criminalize those who we accuse of being gossips too. That hasn't changed, not then and not now. There's, I think most notably, the rise of abusers suing their victims for slander, i.e. Johnny Depp, Marilyn Manson, Justin Baldoni. It's become quite a public spectacle putting these women on trial.
Yeah.
It's a different type of witch hunt, I would say. One that's mostly fueled by like PR firms, reputation. Maybe the consequences aren't necessarily torture and death, but it might mean financial ruin for the rest of your life. It might mean ridicule and death threats for the rest of your life. Of trial, this type of witch hunt is still ongoing.
We've talked about how witches were these seductresses who make men lose control, who are devil copulators. We talk about how witches were seen as those things, but funnily enough, another group of women are also accused of witchcraft, which is the postmenopausal group, quote unquote, offering no financial or reproductive benefit to the men who controlled society, end quote, by Charlotte Rose Miller. Federici argues that most of the women actually accused of being witches were typically older. She says that women past a certain age couldn't serve the sexual or reproductive needs of men, of patriarchy, or of capitalism. That their aged bodies have little left to offer and instead are seen as a drain on the community's resources and burdensome and disposable. But Federici also notes that witch hunts didn't take place all across Europe. So she argues that the accusations of witches and witchcraft were done in sort of more isolated pockets where there was, where there's the end of feudalism that turned to capitalism. Specifically, she notes that Ireland and the Scottish Western Highlands, she says that there were no witch hunts there. And she argues that this is because collective land tenure provided a social safety network to people. And therefore, there was no record of witch hunts. So both young women who were reproducing and older women were somewhat safer in these areas.
Moving beyond Europe, we'd like to talk about the infamous witch trials that occurred here in the good old US of A to kick off or initiate our witch media discourse. The piece of fiction in question doesn't necessarily depict witch characters, only those who are accused of being one.
And of course, what else are we talking about but the Crucible? I mean, most of us in our curriculum here in the US have probably read The Crucible in high school. It's a play written by Arthur Miller in 1953. It's a work of fiction. However, it's very heavily inspired by real events. And it's about the Salem witch trials. Side note, so interesting how the Salem witch trials are really front and center when you think about witch trials, and you don't really think as much about the European witch trials, of which there were many more women who died actually in those witch trials. Mm-hmm. It really sticks in our memories, the Salem witch trials, probably because America is seen as a world power. Probably.
Yeah. Kind of centering themselves in
everything. In everything. Even this horrible history, which okay. Okay. So the Crucible. Yeah, it centrally focuses on the witch trials and the hysteria that it follows or precedes witch trials, really. But there are no witches in this text, unlike some other texts that we will be talking about in part 3. But I think it's really important to understand the frame through which Arthur Miller wrote this play. He really wrote this as a way to talk about McCarthyism and the panic around communism. And I think that this was so much the case of the topic of what he was writing, that the Committee for Un-American Activities, didn't they interrogate him?
They did. They did. They also interrogated, I think, his wife at the time.
Oh my gosh.
Marilyn Monroe.
I mean, when I did not know that until researching for this episode, and you shared that with me, and I it really blew my mind actually. I did not see these two together, but yeah, he was interrogated for being un-American and a conspirator against America. Centrally, the Crucible is about betrayal of self and others when the time comes that fingers are pointed to you. It's about retaining a sense of integrity to yourself, to truth, and to your community. It's about not naming anyone else being hunted. So I think in order to understand this theme, we have to understand a little bit about what the Crucible is about. There is a young woman who accuses John Proctor of being a witch. And she stirs up all of this like hysteria and panic. And he's put on trial. And it's depicted in the ways that we spoke about earlier. It's not really a trial so much as it's just like passing time until the inevitable conclusion. And the real focus on Proctor's character here is he going to try to like save himself? Is he going to like say, no, it was her, no, it was them, and try to like save himself? But he doesn't, and it's like a tragedy, right? It's like, oh, John Proctor is like this this like figure that retained his humanity in this like time of extreme duress.
In the Crucible, I think one might easily argue that Miller sees himself in the protagonist, in John Proctor, as someone who believes in the sanctity of humanity, in the charity with one another, as one who would rather die than sacrifice others and their own values. Miller was questioned by the committee because of the Crucible, in the same way that John Proctor had to answer to these horrid judges accusing him of witchcraft.
Right. Does everyone like John Proctor's character? Like, I don't know. I don't know. Like, but nonetheless, I think this is how Miller wrote the text, as John Proctor as like the protagonist.
Yes.
But it seems as though witchcraft is the mode through which a story about mob mentality is told, and the dangers of quote unquote breaking charity with one another. Like what dangers could arise, because during this time people were being accused of being communists, and they were being interrogated by this like, you know, committee for un-American activities or whatever shit, right? And they were trying to like get people to confess to being communists. So there was like a really strong parallel of what he wrote about and what really was happening and happened to him as well in real life. But changes were made to serve the narrative from like what actually happened historically, because Arthur Miller, he took really strong inspiration in things that happened. Like he was like reading like historical documents. So in reality, the man who, like the actual man who would have been John Proctor, like there was no, okay, let me just reverse here for a little bit. So the girl who accused John Proctor of being a witch, in the Crucible, she was like a 17-year-old girl. If you've ever seen the movie, yes, it's Winona Ryder. She's like, you know, watch it. But it's because there's like some type of sexual relationship between her and John Proctor. So it's sort of like, oh, this girl, she's like vengeful and she's evil for doing this, you know? But in real life, there was no sexual relationship between the young girl, who in real life was like 9 or something, not like 16. And Proctor was like much older than he was in the play. And I think Miller really made this change for like plot reasons, probably, because it's like a more like tantalizing and like story to tell.
A little bit more salacious.
Yeah. So Abigail is really in the Crucible shown as vengeful and antagonistic, and like very vindictive, because she's having an affair with John Proctor, and then she accuses him of witchcraft, and she knows what that means. But there's been spins on the like live plays of the Crucible, and one of them in 2014 by Farber framed the story in a way that made us see John Proctor as an older man abusing his power with a younger girl. So the reality is in the story, Proctor has sex with a 17-year-old Abigail Warren. Right, she's 17, not 15, 16. She's 17. And his later rejection drives her to testify against John Proctor and John Proctor's wife. But instead of portraying Abigail as like vindictive in Farber's production, it suggested that she's more victim than villain. In seeking retribution for a wrong, she exposed Proctor's residual guilt and helped to destroy an already divided Salem. And this is a quote from The Guardian about this very play. So there's a lot of ways, I think, to read the Crucible. I mean, the reality, what really happened with these people, is that Abigail was 9, and she did, in fact, accuse Proctor of witchcraft, but she didn't actually know him before the trials. And you might wonder, like, why would a child accuse a man she doesn't know of witchcraft? And that is a great question. Like, why would a 9-year-old do that? It could be for a lot of reasons, but times were hard. Kids need attention, maybe. I mean, that's one theory I saw. Also, kids do what they're told as well. Someone could have told her to do that. But it's really complicated. And also, Miller changed what, happened in reality to serve his plot. And he really wrote about the idea of the witch hunt, but not witches themselves. So let's move on to talking about actual witches. Part 3. Examining the witch in media and how she transforms through time. It wouldn't be a literary podcast without confronting Shakespeare, unfortunately. But he really does lay the groundwork for the portrayal of witches and witchcraft as we know it. Those specific images and characterization lives on even now.
And of course, we're talking about none other than Shakespeare's Macbeth, and in particular, the 3 witches. So, who are the 3 witches, aka the Weird Sisters? They are, I would say, the spooky characters in Macbeth, and they're instrumental in leading the titular character, Macbeth, to his death. These are 3 women described as having chappy fingers, skinny lips, and also beards, and their ominous and also mischievous presence sets the tone for the play. These sisters are magical women who act like prophets, and they kind of seduce or inspire Macbeth into usurping the throne. And they first appear in Act 1, Scene 1 when they greet him and famously declare, "Fair is foul and foul is fair." This line kind of sets the play's theme, which is moral ambiguity and also deception, with the underlying message that things are not what they seem to appear. They predict Macbeth's ascent to the throne in Act 1, Scene 3 by greeting him with a prophecy saying that he shall be king. And later in Act 4, they gather in front of Macbeth again and show him visions of his death and downfall before vanishing from the play entirely. So if you really think about it, they don't really do much. And their presence compared to some of the other main characters in the play are quite minimal. But even though they don't necessarily take actions themselves, their presence inspires the action, so to speak.
Well, I famously dropped out of 2 Shakespeare classes in college. But I think that even, someone like me who's not like as well versed in Shakespeare, I think even I'm familiar with these witch sisters because they're so iconic. Their imagery is so iconic and replicated through time, like in Hocus Pocus. Even in Sabrina the Teenage Witch, the newer adaptation, they're actually called the Weird Sisters in that adaptation. I'm very excited to get to their most famous lines in a little bit.
So if we ask like how these witches work in the play, and we ask ourselves how they're evil, it's not necessarily so cut and dry. But if you have been listening to our previous episode on the vampire, you would know that the witches operate in a similar manner, or perhaps even the same way that the devil was thought to operate. For example, they don't tell Macbeth to kill King Duncan. Instead, they subtly tempt him, they subtly seduce him into doing it. They infect his mind, his heart, his morals, and it's clear that they're malevolent and that their suggestions are at the forefront of the decisions that Macbeth makes. But beyond whispers and suggestions, it's safe to say that Macbeth's actions are entirely his own. And then you may ask, why would the witches even do that? What do they get out of it, really? Well, in this particular play, the 3 sisters tell you why via their song. And if you aren't familiar with Macbeth, you're more than familiar with these verses.
And this is what I was talking about. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, fillet of fenny snake in the cauldron boil and bake, eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog, adder's fork and blind worm's sting, lizard's leg and howlet's wing, for a charm of powerful trouble, like a hell broth boil and bubble, double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, cool it with a baboon's blood, then the charm is firm and good.
Amazing so far. So, they tell you their main why in the first line of this verse. They just simply want to wreak havoc. They just work to cause extra trouble, I
chaos.
suppose.
They want to cause chaos.
I know, they live for the chaos. And it makes for an interesting play, I think. So, perhaps like further notes on the 3 witches. You might think that these witches seem a little bit more camp than menacing. And I would absolutely agree with you, because the real menace of this play, I would argue, is Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, who I would like to point out is herself an Eve-like figure, tempting her husband into sin. Again, if you listen to our previous podcast, we have a lot about Eve. But in comparison to them two, the witches seem kind of ridiculous. They seem a little funny. They speak in couplets, and everyone else speaks in blank verse. They're described as looking funny, as speaking funny, and acting really funny, but their power is not necessarily in how menacing they don't appear, but in how they are able to inspire and corrupt someone as upright as Macbeth. And that makes them more dangerous than a dagger, than a sword or an arrow. So these three witches, as influential as they are, they're obviously not the earliest texts depicting witches in fictional media, but they are, however, the earliest we will be talking about it because it encapsulates how witches were really seen up until this point, which are evil and gross and nasty women and also temptresses.
And maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this, Jasmine, but I know that the depiction of these three sisters sometimes gets the criticism of being racist. Can you tell us how that works and what that means?
So, a lot of the criticism that not just these three witches, but a lot of witches portrayed in the media, they have very racist undertones. A lot of them are depicted with physical features that are clearly targeted towards like Jewish folk, Romani folk.
Mm-hmm. And their likening to witches is seen as a negative thing. And there's also quite a strong undercurrent or overcurrent of misogyny. And we really see this, in some of the themes we've been talking about so far in this podcast, but I'm really interested in talking about the imagery that's evoked as being domestic. So things like a boiling cauldron, a cauldron really is just a thing like a vessel to cook with that's typically found in the home, in the hearth, and is now being appropriated to be this very menacing center point of witch imagery. There's also the broomstick, really domestic imagery, really domestic tools that are assigned to women's labor within the home that are then being brought into the witch imagery. But they soon become more dynamic. They soon become characters with more depth, which leads us to our second piece of media that we would like to discuss, which is none other than The Wizard of Oz. So, The Wizard of Oz was written in the year 1900 by, you gotta let me know if I'm pronouncing his name wrong, but Baum, B-A-U-M, Baum. He wrote The Wizard of Oz, which destigmatized the witch. He reasserted that there is a good witch and a bad witch depending on the individual, which is one of the first things we opened with. Like, this was a pretty common and accepted view of witches and witchcraft until there were systemic perversions of that witchcraft, likening it to devil worshipping. The Wizard of Oz was such like a controversial book, actually, that even in the 60s, it started being contested and banned in schools. I think that Baum's personal politics are really interesting and probably pretty relevant in the story that he ended up writing. He believed in women's suffrage, which is the women's right to vote. And he was an active participant in the women's suffrage movement. But he also was pro-genocide of indigenous people. He really feared in this idea of quote unquote reverse imperialism, which is something we actually talked about in episode 1 when we were talking about Bram Stoker, and something we probably will continue to revisit in episode 3. He potentially set the track for the good witch representations. And a very interesting fun fact is that his mother-in-law was Matilda Gage, who's a really sort of renowned feminist activist. And she actually likened the witch trials to the persecution of women. And she was an abolitionist and suffragette. And I think it's the relationship between Matilda Gage and Baum is sort of that crossover in history that you might not expect, but one that's super interesting and I think creates more layers in how relevant The Wizard of Oz might be in changing the tone of witches in media.
So kind of expanding on The Wizard of Oz, we must also talk about Wicked. And this musical kind of just grapples with the idea that are people born wicked, or do they have wickedness thrust upon them? And if The Wizard of Oz introduces the dichotomy of the good witch and the evil witch, then Wicked expands on the idea that wickedness is a choice, it's an action, it's what a person chooses to do with the powers that they're imbued with. Before kind of earning their infamous reputations, Glinda and Elphaba, they start as young college roommates, rivals, and eventually friends, and perhaps also secretly lovers. But I digress. Elphaba starts as a young, misunderstood, smart, and magically powerful witch who's cast aside due to her greenness, and maybe because of this, she's really developed a strong moral compass and is unafraid to stand up for what she believes is right. She empathizes with the animal class who are being targeted, disenfranchised, and also caged. The animal class are hunted and surveilled, and they gradually lose their ability to speak, and they're stripped of their humanity. But despite all of this, Elphaba desires to be liked. She wants to fit in. She wishes she weren't green. But most importantly, this desire is not stronger than her sense of justice. In contrast, Glinda is beautiful and popular and is also extremely shrewd and conscious of how outward appearances affect social standing. She sits at the top of the social hierarchy and will do anything to maintain that position. She understands how the power of public perception carries favor, and this favor is sometimes even stronger than magic itself. Thus, she's extremely aware of how she's being perceived by other people and is protective of her self-image. She understands the power of likability. But in her friendship with Elphaba, Glinda, after many false starts, learns to stand up for justice against fascism. Elphaba's and Glinda's friendship is tested by their moral conflicts and societal pressures. They're forced to choose between their morals, ethics, and values, and risk being hunted, or their proximity to power and be publicly adored. And while Elphaba decides to rebel against the fascist dictator known as the Wizard, she offers Glinda the chance to go with her, but Glinda decides to stay back and work with the Wizard. And by aligning herself with the authoritative and fascist leader, Glinda is rewarded by becoming Glinda the Good. And Elphaba, someone who challenges the status quo, becomes a revolutionary and is branded as accused of being the Wicked Witch of the West.
So, who is wicked? What is wickedness? Like Macbeth, the character with the most wickedness is none other than a human man. But also, like Macbeth, public perception of accountability and responsibility seem to sit mostly on the shoulders of the witches. That is to say, wickedness is perception. In a world where witches and wizards are common and indeed occupy the upper echelons of society, it is surprising that witch hunts are still prevalent. The victim of the hunt is not really targeted because of her magical powers, though she is exceptionally powerful, but mostly because she's a credible threat to the established social order built on fascism, discrimination, and incarceration. Basically, patriarchy is at the center of the creation of a monster.
We ask ourselves, who's able to wield true power? Well, it's true that Elphaba is the singular, most magically powerful character in the text. She is no match against the power wielded by the non-magical wizard. That is to say, perception is greater than strength, the many is greater than the one, and systemic power is greater than magical power. Social power triumphs against magical power, which is something that I think Linda understands fully well. Power determines who is wicked, who is evil. And how is it that a human man is able to lead an authoritarian regime in a society that has far more individuals, far more powerful than him?
Yeah, that's a really good question you pose. And one that I think is really relevant to our real experience, our like in real time today, because there is power in numbers in a people's movement. There are more people than there are ruling class elite. Yet our social systems remain as such. Moving past the evil human man known as the Wizard of Oz, we unfortunately are moving on to an evil human known as J.K. Rowling. Oh gosh, yeah, we gotta talk about her. She's a massive transphobe. She's a TERF and just like really overall terrible person. And her books sealed the deal in transforming media depictions of the witch, and none other than Harry Potter.
So beyond the iconic aesthetic of the Harry Potter world, this series really made witches and wizards inspiring heroes and even role models that children can look up to. And I don't necessarily think that the Harry Potter series explicitly made witches beloved, but by portraying witches and wizards as kind, capable, and intelligent protagonists, they were able to soothe a lot of the lingering suspicions about them. And I suppose what helps a lot is that the magic system in the series is very clearly not satanic nor demonic. And most importantly, perhaps, having cute white kids as protagonists really defanged any fear of magic and instead focuses on how a person themselves is wielding magic. In this series, magic is not a choice. A magical person cannot choose to be non-magical for their own safety's sake. And I think something really interesting while I was doing a little bit of research on this is that Harry really occupies some sort of Christ-like figure. There's a Reddit comment. I apologize that I did not notate their username, but this Reddit comment, quote, "A prophesized birth with a prestigious lineage that traces back to a legendary forefather. He had to flee from his birthplace as a baby as evil hunted him. Was the fixation and target of a prime evil associated with snakes, sacrificed himself and died to save others, then resurrected after death to deliver the ultimate salvation.
No, that's Jesus, Jasmine. You actually just described Jesus. And Harry Potter.
That's Jesus and Harry Potter.
Yeah. That's such an interesting analysis. It makes it sound a lot like Jesus. Yeah. Yeah. And, like you said, the magic system in Harry Potter is not derived from any satanic forces. And I think that is such an important piece of making the witch not a monster anymore. No longer does a witch have to make a deal with the devil, copulate with the devil, and get her powers from this very nefarious, evil way. But instead, in the Harry Potter universe, they're simply born a witch, and they just inherit these magical powers from their family genetics. It's something that's totally beyond their control. And there's also this very academic piece to it. They have to work to get better at their magic. So it totally changes the narrative of the witch.
Something that's also really interesting with this magical system of magical inheritance is that there's also a form of magic supremacy in this world. A lot of wizards and witches believe that not all power is acquired equally. Pureblood supremacists like the Death Eaters and Voldemort, they believe that only purebloods were real witches and wizards. And they're really racist about it too. There's a lot of anti-miscegenation influences in this. They thought that the promotion and acceptance of the mixture of magical and non-magical blood would dilute and quote dirty the wizard identity, and they thought of muggle-born magical witches as impure and unworthy of magic itself. So when Voldemort seized control of the Ministry of Magic, he implemented a registry in which muggle-borns had to register with the Muggle-born Registration Commission, essentially creating a list that targeted them and their safety. Political propaganda claimed that they were really muggles who had stolen magic from real wizards and witches, and the punishment for being a muggle-born or supporting muggle-borns was Azkaban, which is prison, or the Dementor's Kiss, which is something worse than prison. Even with all of this going on, Harry Potter is ultimately a children's story, and it centers on children. It's hard to hate or even find evilness in kids. Even someone like Draco has a little bit of a redemption arc somehow. And also, just by way of the release schedule of the film, it really made you feel like you were growing up with these characters.
And there's some type of emotional journey and arc that their magic plays a really big role in teaching them something about themselves. I enjoy things like Sabrina the Teenage Witch, the vibe of practical magic, the film, things like The Craft, Charmed, Witches of Eastwick, Bewitched, and even Matilda. I'm going to put Matilda on there too. I think Matilda's a little witchy. All of that media is really immersed in our reality. There's a level of magical realism there. She's very girl next door. It's all about empowerment. They're very likable characters. It's also quite aspirational. She has a coven, these matrilineal families. It's very empowering, though it's also very white. right? And that's something that, despite me really enjoying this type of media, I'm also largely left out of. But something that I can participate in, if I choose to, is the whimsy gothic aesthetic that was sort of born out of some of this really popular 90s media. But this media and these aesthetics is really what helped pave the way for nearly the full reclamation of the witch identity.
In this section, we started at Shakespeare and we ended at Harry Potter. I guess the British really do have a chokehold on witch media, but that's probably due to cultural imperialism and our own Western biases and ethnocentrism. But indeed, I mean, the witch has come a long way from evil, sinister, menacing monsters to adorable academic munchkins saving the world. The witch has been it all. Friend, foe, hero, or villain. There is no shortage of imagining the witch's endless possibilities. But it's precisely this expansiveness, this humanization, that lays the groundwork for our next section. Section 4, Reclamation of the Witch Identity. The large shift in representation of the witch in media mirrored cultural attitudes towards witches in society, from being hunted, tortured, and persecuted for allegedly being a witch to self-proclaimed witches in bell-bottoms, marching in the streets, fighting for women's rights. The witch, the identity, the practice has all been effectively reclaimed.
The 60s were a groovy time for social change. Fed up with the conditions women were subjected to in society, many women's liberation groups were started. One said group that focused on reclaiming the witch identity in particular to advance women's liberation was called WITCH, which was formed on Halloween in 1968, when members dressed up as witches and marched down to Wall Street to protest male dominance and capitalism. They were known for aligning themselves with radical feminist ideology, which has many issues, namely TERFdom. They put on these elaborate political performances, much like the Yippies did, which was another social group in the 60s. Political performance was big at this time. Witch was an acronym for many things, but originally it was an acronym for Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell.
I can't even fathom this. I don't know. I think as like Muslim people, we really cannot self-identify. We can't fuck with this.
Yes, it's like it truly is only white women that can like self-identify as terrorists from hell. Oh yeah, our Muslim identities are like, oh, wow, it's terrifying. Why would you do that? Their manifesto is as follows.
Witch is an all-woman everything. It's theater, revolution, magic, terror, joy, garlic flowers, and spells. It's an awareness that witches and a very outdated, very racist slur used to refer to Romani people were the original guerrillas and resistance fighters against oppression, particularly the oppression of women down through the ages. Witches have always been women who dared to be groovy and courageous and aggressive, intelligent, nonconformist, explorative, curious, independent, sexually liberated, and revolutionary. And This possibly explains why 9 million of them have been burned.
I want you to notice that last statement. In their manifesto, they claimed that 9 million witches were burned. Except this was not true, and instead was directly lifted from Matilda Jocelyn Gage. And if you were paying close attention, yes, this is the mother-in-law of the man who wrote The Wizard of Oz. She was the first known feminist to reclaim the image of the witch from her previously persecuted state. She was a suffragette who was active in the middle to late 19th century. In their essay on the erasure of Gage from feminist history, Zenita Fenton writes that Gage was a critic of organized Christian faith, stating that the church was one of the greatest structures that oppressed women, end quote. Gage believed that, quote, the church oppressed women by supporting the witch hunts, for she noticed that women who acquired knowledge in medicine and healing arts were the women most often targeted, as their extensive knowledge about science and healing was a threat to patriarchal structure, end quote from Fenton. Gage took the first step in acknowledging how the church used its power to kill, imprison, or exile women who seemed to move past their particular place in society, and ultimately turned the witch into a martyr, a symbol for the unjust treatment and oppression of women.
Gage's martyrization of the witch would remain present in the feminist iconography that followed. Modern representations of the witch in literature and film and feminist theory, especially radical feminist theory, the witch assumes the role of both victim and heroine. She is idolized as a symbol of triumph, self-actualization, and power, while also serving as a figure of victimhood and oppression. End quote.
So essentially, she equated womanhood with victimhood, and those who survive are triumphant. If you want to read more, there's an article called Troubling the Witch, the Issues of Class and Morality in Modern Depiction of Witches. Between Gage's writing in the 1900s and Witch, as in Witch Manifesto, Witch political group, and Federici's writings, between that is where we get Lolly Willows by Sylvia Townsend Warner in 1927. This is the first major feminist text that depicts witchcraft that is by a woman. The text is essentially about a woman making a pact with Satan to be liberated from domestic duties. A quote from the book is as follows: "One does not become a witch to run around, to be harmful, or to be helpful either. It is to escape all of that, to have a life of one's own, not an existence doled out by others." End quote. In the same text, Satan says all women are witches and just don't know it. As in, all women have the freedom to free themselves from the social constructs that oppress them. I think that this is pretty interesting that we get a text like this in 1927.
I agree with Satan. I have an affinity with the Satan of this text, who believes... I don't know how to say it without sounding super blasphemous, but I suppose I can be a little bit.
Yes.
I do agree with this Satan in the text, who argues that all women are witches and don't know it, that all women have the freedom to free themselves of the social constructs that oppress them.
I think that the desire to escape these domestic duties is a really big piece in second wave feminism. The desire to move from the private sphere to the public sphere for women. And I think that this is really what Warner was writing about in Lolly Willows. And we see that continuing on from Gage's writings, even all the way to Federici's writings. You know, this is 70 years where the witch is talked about in this way, where there's this really strong attempt to reclaim witches. And one of my personal favorite witches, you can say, during this time that found empowerment in this very second wave reclamation of the witch identity was none other than Shirley Jackson. Shirley Jackson is the author of many incredible horror and gothic novels that deal with the condition of women. And she herself was an amateur witch in her own words. She writes that witchcraft, quote, is a practical method for influencing the world, a way of embracing and channeling female power at a time when women in America often had little control over their lives. We can see that in some of her books, she also deals with this idea of witchcraft. She depicts female characters who, in their own way, practice witchcraft. I'm thinking of Mary Cat in Constance's dynamic here. Shirley Jackson was stuck between two roles, one as a homemaker and one as a writer. She found empowerment in the witch in a disempowering world. We know that part of her storytelling was pulled from her personal experiences, the domestic duties that fell on her, raising children, having an unfaithful husband, and experiencing anxiety and depression. Jackson, at times, writes about these sort of witchy themes and characters in her works. She writes about women that are trapped in places, trapped within themselves, and she also writes about demons and witches in more literal ways. In The Adventures of James Harris, published in 1949, a short story entitled The Demon Lover, recounts a woman encountering a romantic demon who proposes to rescue her and then vanishes, leaving her alone on the brink of madness in a very frightening place. Shirley Jackson, maybe she was toying with the media's and literary circles' idea of her. Maybe it was a little tongue-in-cheek, but she really embraced this label of a witch. And I'd love for Jasmine to read one of her self-written bios.
I live in a dank old place with a ghost that stomps around in the attic room we've never gone into. I think it's walled up. And the first thing I did when we moved in was to make charms in black crayon on all the door sills and window ledges to keep out demons, and was successful in the main. There are mushrooms growing in the cellar, and a number of marble mantles which have an unexplained habit of falling down onto the heads of the neighbors' children. At the full of the moon, I can be seen out in the backyard digging for mandrakes, of which we have a little patch, along with rhubarb and blackberries. I do not usually care for these herbal or batwing recipes because you can never be sure how they will turn out. I rely almost entirely on image and number magic.
Shirley Jackson may or may not have been a witch. She may have been playing with us all. She may have really believed in reclaiming the witch identity for her personal liberation. She may have cast spells in her home too. It could be anything. It could be both. It could be either. I think that regardless of that, the fact that people remember her as a witch and she played with this witch identity is something that I find really quite interesting. So we've talked about how the witch identity has been pretty effectively reclaimed and how a lot of negative stereotypes have been changed over time. And I would go even as far to say that the witch at a period of time was a symbol for female power and female resistance. But is that always a good thing? In a video essay entitled How the Witch Became a Feminist Icon and How It Failed by, I believe, the book Leo, she encourages us to think about how, while it might be exciting to believe that the witches who were persecuted in the witch hunts may have actually been witches, that they really were not, that there was no witchcraft actually happening. But there is a lot of literature that describes the witch hunts with the woman being hunted as an actual witch, which may inadvertently and unintentionally do the opposite of what it's meaning to do. It might unintentionally give some legitimacy to the claims that the women who were hunted during the witch hunts were actual witches, and that's why they were hunted. 85% of those tried as witches were women. I think that this was a time that society was largely afraid of women and believed that women were secretly puppeteering or masterminding what was happening in society or the world at large, whether that was the weather, the crop, intimate relationships, politics. And in this video by the book Leo, she likens it to incel logic, which I think is a really interesting point, that incels also believe that women are sort of puppeteering the whole show because women are in control of who men are allowed to have sex with in this very like heteronormative frame, obviously, because they're incels. But it feels pretty similar to the same mechanism feels similar to how conservatives feel about DEI initiatives and people of color actually like having more opportunity or puppeteering things from behind the curtain when that's not true. But in reality, the women who were persecuted in the witch hunts were not witches, despite it being exciting and fun maybe to imagine if they were, like in books like the Practical Magic series or Slewfoot. In reality, they just occupied vulnerable roles in society, and they were people who did not have power in their respective societies. But you may be asking, isn't that exactly why we should reclaim the identity of the witch? Isn't that exactly why the witch can feel very empowering? That those who are disenfranchised can access a type of power that can free them? Well, I would argue that even in media, not all people can access the empowerment of witchcraft equally. Just like in our real world, the literary world mirrors the way that white women have access to resources and power over those that are people of color. Despite the witch being used as a symbol that could transcend these oppressive systems, she is actually limited by the same social structures as everyone else. One notable example of witches not having equal power across the board is seen in the movie The Craft. The Craft follows a group of teenage girls who are aspiring to be witches who need a final girl to complete their coven that will bring them the power that they want. And the final girl that they choose is a lineage witch who also happens to be really wealthy and white. And if you haven't seen it, slight spoiler, close your ears. But basically, what is shown is that the girls who are not born witches and also shown as having less class privilege than the lineage witch are opportunistic, and they cannot retain the power that they found in witchcraft because they don't have the same privileges as the lineage witch. I think that really shows that it's not an equal opportunity or access, even in our fantasy or fictional world, that witches have, equal access to power. I also think it's notable the way that Black witches are portrayed in vampire media, typically as side characters, B-plot all the way down. They're typically not given their own independent storylines where their identities are hugely important, but instead are, in a way, appropriated and fetishized. I also want to take some time to talk about magic lessons. Magic Lessons is the first book in the Practical Magic series, and
it's wild. It's crazy. It's actually insane. I haven't read it, but you must told me all about it, and I could not believe my ears.
It left me so confused. It follows. So, for those of you who haven't seen Practical Magic, it's sort of about these sisters trying to navigate this generational and ancestral curse that one of their, ancestors put on their family. And the curse is if you can never really love someone or else they'll die, basically. Really terrible curse. And they're trying to navigate their lives with it. And these sisters have really different ways of dealing with it. And then the first book is about the ancestor who cast the curse on her lineage to follow. And it's weird. some weird stuff happens. So the main character is a white girl, though she finds herself in Curacao and working on a plantation, and is she's very oppressed in this setting. But it was really interesting to read. It felt like reality was inversed a little bit reading this book, because in reality, white women would have been part of the oppressing class, part of the potentially enslaving class. And it was confusing as well, because the man that she falls in love with, has a relationship with, is actually a judge who persecutes witches. And he is like visiting his friend on this plantation, like the owner of the plantation in Curacao, and that's where they meet. And the the depictions of I can't even talk about it. It's so wild. He like comes to the island and he feels like so sexually liberated, which feels so awful to read. It feels so weird to read. So the novel uses historical figures as characters, and the judge that we're talking about is based on John Hawthorne, who was a magistrate of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he was a prominent judge in the witch trials, and he killed like 19 people, were put to death when he was a judge for witchcraft. So yes, I'm sure the book is saying something, mm-hmm. something, right? I don't know that I fully absorbed it or grasped it, because there were some really glaring and problematic issues I found with the book. This white girl was viewed as one of the most oppressed people in the book, despite there were like actually enslaved people on this plantation. That felt really confusing to me. I think that there's this level of mysticism that comes that was sort of talked about on the island of Curacao in this book. Mysticism, appropriation of these more ancient magic systems. And it just reminded me a bit about what we were talking about earlier, about Black witches, specifically in vampire media, how voodoo is like made to be a caricature. I'm really thinking about Madame Zeroni in Holes, like her whole character. And it's really demonized. Voodoo is really demonized. And the way that it's portrayed in media gets like this pass because it's fictional. But I think that it does something really bad to people's popular image of voodoo, because it portrays voodoo as something that's violent rather than spiritual, which is feeling really regressive to the things that we've been talking about. Like a lot of this reclamation of the witch identity has largely been still for white people, I think, at the end of the day, for white women at the end of the day. So I think that the fact that voodoo is still portrayed in such like problematic, racist ways, it feels like there's not actually been made a lot of progress here. It's still likened to satanic ritual, which is exactly what allows people to dehumanize another person. Is if you're devilish, then all of the rules of how we're supposed to treat people go out the window. And for this reason, I sometimes feel left out of witch media because of this history, because of this involvement of whiteness, and because there is empowerment for some, notably white women, and that just isn't me or you, Jasmine. It just isn't us.
Absolutely. So we've reached the conclusion of this episode, and we ask ourselves, are witches monsters? Perhaps at one point, yes. But now, maybe not. Once they were evil demon lovers bent on corrupting all that is good and holy, now they're cute rom-com protagonists and child heroes. An interesting transformation for sure, but as we alluded to at the end of our last section, one that's not very compelling to us. That's maybe because we have to ask ourselves, who is the witch? And in my mind's eye, I can't help but conjure a white woman. This disarming white girl or woman with magical abilities, sweet or precocious, always helpful, bonded by something of a sorority. And this is the version of witchcraft that has been popularized and reclaimed, but not one that is decidedly very me or you, Soha, or us.
Or us, right. Yeah. Unfortunately not.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to be part of that world, to be part of this community, but it is inherently feels so exclusionary.
It does, and it's interesting that we feel so differently about this than we do the vampire. Because I think that we even mentioned that in the vampire episode, there aren't like a ton of women vampires. But still, something about what the vampire represents felt closer to us somehow. The witch somehow feels further away, which is paradoxical maybe, but I mean, the idea of being able to make potions and move things with your magical abilities and have this sense of otherworldly power, like that sounds really cool. That sounds really fun. Like I can't say that, right? Like that sounds awesome. Like I do enjoy watching some of this like 90s witch iconic media, but ever since I was young, I couldn't really insert myself into those stories as easily as I could in other stories. And that's not always the point, I don't think. But I think with the witch, maybe part of it is the point. It is imagining a different version of yourself that is more powerful and can overcome your circumstances. But like we talked about before, we don't really get to see witches in media that look like us, because even in media, they can't transcend the forces that are oppressive to us. Even though the vibe and the aesthetic and the world seems so fun and exciting in the more modern depictions of witches, you know, as much as I would love to be like a Matilda moving things with my mind, like, I don't know, I can't fully sink into it because of how tied up the imagery of the witch, both politically and in media and literature, how tied up it is in whiteness. There are some things that I think would be interesting to see in witch media a little bit more. And on the top of that list for me is people of color not being used as mystical elements to advance a white woman's story, character, or the plot in general. This is something that I see in witch media from time to time, and I don't like it. I don't like it. It doesn't make me feel good. It's harder for me to be in that world then. I also feel that in witchcraft there is some level of gender essentialism. In this episode, we've been using the word woman a lot, and I think that typically the use of that word within the parameters of some of this witch research is like assigned female at birth. There's a strong emphasis on femininity and having a uterus and having power from your sex. And I don't really resonate with that personally. And I think that feels a bit exclusionary to me. And the fact that J.K. Rowling wrote a very pivotal piece of witch literature, and she herself is a TERF, I don't know how much you can separate the art from the artists, like how much of that ideology bleeds into the things that she wrote. So anyhow, the gender essentialist aspect of witchcraft and people of color being used as mystical plot devices are things that I want to see less of. How about you, Jasmine?
No, absolutely, 100%. Sometimes I feel like when the witch became reclaimed by embracing all of the images of witchcraft that are closely aligned with like domesticity, whether it be like the cauldron or the broomstick, it like really leaned in so hard that it almost kind of feels similar to when people talk about things like the divine feminine. I feel like that kind of witchy spirituality is like so closely linked, and I can't help but think that this sort of gender essentialism is not necessarily like liberation. It just makes you feel better and complacent in living in systems of oppression. And instead of liberation, it just feels more like girl bossing your way through capitalism. I don't know, it feels kind of icky. But I also am like, I don't want to say like, don't. Does that make sense? Like, I don't want to tell people how they can or cannot. I don't know, actually.
Mm-hmm. You and I come from these Muslim backgrounds where I think it's not that witchcraft doesn't exist. I think it's just like heavily stigmatized and seen as evil still. Kind of what we were alluding to earlier about how like, yeah, we were kind of alluding to some of that stuff earlier. But I grew up with this idea that there was some magical practices out there that were used for bad things. I don't think that it's been reclaimed in the Muslim community is what I'm trying to say.
I think in the Muslim community, you're trying to protect yourselves against witches and witchcraft.
Sure. Definitely. I think, though, that's our cultural, religious experience, there are plenty of people who have really different experiences that are people of color. And I'm thinking about voodoo, like we talked about earlier. I'm thinking about brujas. And I think that it would be really interesting to see more honest representations of these histories of magic, actually centering people of color and in a meaningful way try to capture these very like pre-Christian and sometimes even anti-establishment movements that have often included or overlapped with people of color and witchcraft. So I think that would be really interesting, and I don't see a ton of that, but I think that would be cool to see more of in witch media. But it's so dominated by these very specific witch tropes that we talked about. However, I do think that some of this change is coming as of like pretty recently, actually. I'm reading The Bewitching by Silvia Moreno Garcia right now, and I think that's a really good example of trying to incorporate POC, Latinx, witchcraft into this story that also somewhat captures this New England white woman witch narrative. There's also a couple other books like Cemetery Boys, The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, that have, you know, more people of color and queer people and trans people in them. So I think that that's really cool that we're seeing that. But let us know what some witch media that you've interfaced with, that you love, that you've seen, that break out of the bounds of white woman gender essentialist empowerment. Because I'm very curious. I'm very curious to absorb more of this media. Because like we said, there is something about conjuring a sense of power that is really exciting. But there are some very real barriers for my full immersion in those stories. I see that quote often, like, we are the daughters of witches that you could not hunt or could not kill. And it's like, actually, are you? Or like, are you the daughters of like enslavers? Or
are you daughters of the Confederacy? I
don't know. Like, maybe there's more to the story there, but I think the same feeling I got when I was reading magic lessons of white women trying to distance themselves from their position of privilege it mirrors what really I see and I have seen for quite a long time. This evasion of accountability and responsibility and reckoning with one's privilege. But you know, like, you don't even have to do all that, because like, if you're Irish or Scottish, like, there's a really cool tradition of witchcraft there. There's really cool like folklore stuff, like in this Celtic tradition that I would love to see that more. Like, I am not opposed to that at all, but often the positioning is different. It's a little different. So I don't know. Yeah. And that was our second episode in our monster mini-series on the witch. We enjoyed researching this. There's so much information on witches in like the academy, online, and media. There was so much to parse through. We tried our best to bring what we thought was most relevant or compelling, and tried to make it somewhat comprehensive, but there's so much that we haven't talked about. There's so much more to the witch. But we hope you enjoyed what we were able to offer you. And we hope that you will tune in next time for our third and final episode of our monster mini-series.